Hi, everybody. Tony Cossack here for the Tony Cossack Show. Today we have Kent Halliburton on, who is the co-founder of Sazmining, a Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining company based out of Maryland. So, without further ado, I hope you enjoy the show. Just as a quick follow up, I want to make sure that you know the purpose of this podcast, and that is I interview business owners in the DMV to get their story to help you continue to persevere. So I hope you find some nuggets in here and find the story to be valuable, and make sure you be your best self. Talk to you soon. Well, Kent, thanks for being on the show. I really appreciate it. We have the founder or the CEO and co-founder of Sazmining on the show today. Kent, how are you today?
I'm most excellent. Thanks for having me, Tony.
Yeah, no problem, man, no problem. So I really wanted to just jump in here, Kent, and just kind of get an idea of not only SAS mining, but really I want to get an idea before SAS mining. I want to back up a little bit and bring us up to SAS mining, if that's okay. So tell me a little bit about your background before starting or becoming the CEO of SAS mining.
Oof, yeah, that's it's a little bit of a circuitous path to
Okay.
get there. I know nobody has a linear journey in life, but
Isn't
mine
that the truth?
yeah, mine is particularly left and right and all over the place. But so I guess let's see where to start. You don't want to hear about the birthing process or anything, but I did grow up on the Oregon coast.
Okay.
Went to college on the Central California coast for computer engineering, and right after
Okay.
that, I went into rooftop solar.
Okay.
Worked in that industry for about a decade, and the last company I worked for there, I worked for two. The last company was publicly traded. It was competing with Elon Musk's cousins. I was in the Bay Area of California at this point, and had a staff of about 100, nine-figure revenue responsibilities, and on top of all that, was also in charge of software and integrating acquisitions that we made in the business. And so it was quite a lot of responsibility, and it was leading to burnout. I was in my early 30s at this point, and said, okay, it's kind of a good time in life. The board and their wisdom brought in a new CEO. Not liking what I'm seeing here. Yeah, let me go fulfill another world dream, which is travel the world. And so I took off and went on a walkabout for a couple
There
of
you
years,
go.
and yeah, I had quite innumerable experiences, let's say culturally, and learned a lot. And when the dust settled 2 years later, I'd fallen in love with a Portuguese woman and Bitcoin. And so my life was going in 2016 in Portugal, living the American dream just on the other side of the pond. And being obsessed at this point, 2016, with Bitcoin and just understanding its potential on a philosophical level, I always said, oh my gosh, I have to put my efforts into this and learning. So I tried my hand at a whole bunch of various entrepreneurial activities, but the combination of not having a network there and not knowing the local language and the entrepreneurial environment just totally different. It's really hard to understand how different a culture can be about entrepreneurship until you live in it, if you've
Okay.
only ever existed in the US. But the US is uniquely entrepreneurial, is what I would say. The idea of failure as a positive is a uniquely American attribute that I've come to realize. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, no.
Failures mean that you're learning and you're failing forward in life, right? And that's not a shared attitude around the world. So anyway, all these challenges, I basically, kept trying things and not getting them off the ground, at least not to the point where I could make it a sustainable business. And then I read a book called The Price of Tomorrow by a fellow named Jeff Booth, and that talked about how Bitcoin mining was going to converge with solar energy because solar was getting so cheap. And I was like, oh my gosh, what have I been doing? I belong in Bitcoin mining. And so I found Will, who is Will Samasegi, who is the founder of Saz Mining, on a solar podcast. This was late 2020, and I knew the podcast host and asked to be put in touch. And one thing led to another. Will said, "Come join." and we've built what we have here today at Sazmining.com. But yeah, it was quite a journey to get here, that's for sure. And then about a little more than a year ago now, Will, is a few years younger than I am, and he wanted to pursue some other things and said, the way you're running this, man, I prefer to just hand you the reins. And so I took over the leadership post for the company, yeah, about a year ago.
That is awesome. You have definitely uncovered a lot there, Kent. So thank you very much for that. I want to back up a little bit in regards to the management of a nine-figure business before we get to SaaS mining, because there's so much with Bitcoin that I've got questions for you that I think the audience is really going to love just due to the environment that we're in. But before we get there, talk to me about some of the challenges, if you will, that there are in managing such a team of such numbers where kind of what was tough in the beginning, what did you figure out, and like and how did you enable to like carry that forward to SaaS mining?
Yeah, I think the greatest lesson that I learned was I didn't want to manage that many people again if I could help it.
Okay.
You know,
Yeah.
the more people you have, the more complicated it gets. And so I think that, we do mining as a service here, and I intentionally tell my staff, we've got like 11 guys on the team right now, and I intentionally tell them, it's like, hey, we got to automate everything because I'm not interested in just adding headcount to figure things out. And so, we've got kind of a maniacal focus on that. But that was genuinely one of the learning lessons, with a team of about 100 that I was managing. I had outside sales organizations in 9 different states. And I had an inside sales team. I had a couple of software folks. And then, I had layers of hierarchy to manage all that. Because, I mean, realistically, a human being can't effectively manage much more than 8 to 10 people. It's been my personal experience. I mean, I've managed up to about 20 personally myself, but geez, you just get spread so thin, and people need your time and attention, right? So if you're going to start to get a big organization, you're forced to introduce hierarchy into it. I think the idea of having a flat structure completely with lots of headcount is kind of a misnomer.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, those are some of the challenges that I faced managing such a big team. But I think one of the things that was also a lesson that I learned, was able to pull through, is I started in that industry in 2005, and because I started actually, despite having a computer engineering background, I went into sales first, and then built a career track in leadership and sales management. In that process, I was always out in the field, and so I never really had like an office environment that I ever worked in, and so I've always worked remotely. And as a result, like learning how to build teams and learning how to manage team dynamics at a remote only environment, I think is. I just got lucky. Like, everybody was kind of like pushed into it through COVID, right?
Yeah.
Everybody had to work from home, but I'd never really worked from an office. I would come in and out of an office every now and then, but that wasn't my home base. My home base
Right.
was my home. And so as a result, like it was like old hat for me to build a remote only team. I didn't find it particularly challenging.
That's great, man. That's great. So you went from finding getting a group of individuals, or a massive group, almost 100 employees or 100 employees, to really being as efficient as possible to manage that business. um, from there, you got involved with Will. Tell me a little bit more about that and kind of how that transition went from solar to where you are today.
Yeah, so I was looking around for opportunities in the mining space, and it's a fairly small industry, but it's quite opaque. And so, being in Portugal, opportunities to interact physically with people were a challenge. So I was looking online for resources to, learn about, and I came across this podcast, the crypto mining podcast, I think is what Will had called it at that point in time, and Sazmining crypto podcast or something like that. Anyhow, I think we've changed the name a bit since then, but that podcast I listened to and I learned quite a bit about mining. I was at that point in time, I had my first child and, was pretty hands-on, like, but I could keep, the AirPods in my ears, listening and learning. And so I was listening to this guy talk. I was like, God, it makes a lot of sense what he's saying. And so then when I heard a particular podcast that was with a fellow that's now an advisor, a solar podcast host, and I knew him, I said, hey, can you put me in touch with Will? I'd like to see if there's an opportunity to work together here. And so when we first started conversing, there was a couple other folks with the organization at that point, and Will said, "Hey, why don't you talk to these guys and let's see what they think." And but when it was all said and done, I came on as an energy advisor to the organization. It was basically, where I was like, "Hey, I know I'm going to work in this in the Bitcoin space. I know I want to work in Bitcoin mining, so." Just whatever. You want me to pack around a cup of coffee digitally? Like happy to, just put me in, coach. Let's get started here. And
Yeah.
so just having that attitude, it was like, okay, whatever you need, Will, I'll help you out here and figure it out. And so we what we were doing at that particular moment was we developed a couple of large sites to do Bitcoin mining. And by large sites, I mean, using as much power as, gosh, let's see here, probably like 15,000 homes, let's say,
Okay.
worth of power. Like just to make it more concrete, we had developed, with the local economic community boards and had all the permits, everything ready to go. And it was during the last big bull market, 2021, that we were raising capital. And so it was a good environment to raise capital, go build these.
Yeah.
And we did raise $1 million, but that $1 million was still a failure because it wasn't enough to build these projects. We need at least 7 million. And so that led to, I think, a pretty important pivot point for the organization where um, we had to have a good think, and Will had this idea of what we've now built. He had the rough vision for it, and now it's become much more fleshed out. But yeah, we went on to take that $1 million and go back to our investors and say, look, we appreciate the $1 million, but we can't go do what we said we were with this investment. Can we use it as pre-seed capital to go execute on this idea? And to their credit, their investors said, yeah, we believe in you guys. So we went off and started building, and that was the critical inflection point, I think, for the organization.
That's awesome, man. That's awesome. All right. So let's talk about Bitcoin. And just so you know, I know a little bit. Okay. I'm not an expert by any means, but let's talk about Bitcoin and then Bitcoin mining, if that's okay. Or
Sure.
would you prefer to do it the other way around?
No, I think the order you're suggesting is the right way.
Okay, great. So let's talk about Bitcoin and kind of what your vision is of where we see. Of course, we've got a new incoming president. We've got a number of nominees that are coming into office. I don't know all of their names, but a lot of them seem to be crypto friendly, if you will. What are your thoughts of where we were and where we are, and then where you think we're going in regards to Bitcoin right now?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, and I'm not exactly sure how it happened, but Bitcoin has become a bit of a loaded word, right?
Yes,
And so because it's got now all this emotional baggage around it, which I guess in some ways, just given, how sensitive conversations about money are, like it does make some sense it's become so loaded. But let me just ask a question or two for you and your audience,
sure.
Tony, since I don't know your background. But what is your take on what Bitcoin is before I
So,
I
great
I I
question.
get into get
Yeah.
into explaining
Yeah, to give you a lay of the
explaining it.
land, my understanding is that it's a digital currency that we are looking to use in an effort to um and correct me if I'm wrong, this may be the wrong way that I'm going with it, but not to replace the dollar, but in effect, make it worth the ability to use for transactions? Is that like completely off the radar, or is because like I have very minimal understanding of it, but is that kind of the where am I with that?
No, you're not wrong. With anything you've said. And so yeah, you've got I would say a high level or surface level understanding of Bitcoin.
Yes.
Let me let me let me ask one other question that
Sure, man.
I'll circle around, and this will become relevant in a minute. But
Okay.
are you um, um, are you familiar at all with how gold became money, like spontaneously thousands of years ago in multiple cultures around the planet?
So no, I am not familiar with how gold became its, I want to say, rock, if you will, how everything got based off of gold. No, I am not familiar with that.
Okay. And the reason I ask that is because I would say 95% of the economy is not. And I would
Okay.
say the 5% of the economy that is are all Bitcoiners.
Okay.
And so this is the secret. So there is I think Joe Kernan on Squawk Box yesterday. I don't know if he did it intentionally, but he sort of dressed down the CIO when the CIO was, they were talking about Bitcoin and how it's gone up 40% since the election, and compound annual growth for 15 plus years at 60%. And Joe says, you really missed it, didn't you? And the CIO is like, yeah, you're right, but we got the equity market. And I think that that actually was, like, for me, a bit of a window into what I think is the emperor that has no clothes, right?
Okay.
So the traditional finance community, and I'm great people. There's nothing wrong with this. But what I would say, the reason why Bitcoin has been missed is because although there's a deep understanding about how to manipulate money, there's not a deep understanding of what money itself is. And if there was an understanding of what money itself is, then TradFi would have showed up at Bitcoin's doorstep much, much earlier. And it's
Okay.
why the Bitcoin community got there much earlier. So there are objectively characteristics on which humanity has decided different items are money across time and space. And these are objective, they're not just narrative driven, but it's why thousands of years ago, gold emerged as money spontaneously in different communities across the planet because gold had those characteristics. One of which is scarcity. Another would another another characteristic is fungibility, meaning that you can trade one equal amount for another equal amount anywhere on the planet, and it's going to be treated roughly the same. Um, another is divisibility, meaning you can take, like, a big block of it and break it down into smaller components. So there's durability is another. Gold is the most stable element on the planet, but all these characteristics that gold has, Bitcoin also has, right?
Okay.
And it removes the main weakness that gold has on why we even got to a fiat currency based environment in the first place. So a bit of history here. If you want to read it, read into it. Fantastic book, best book to understand the history of how gold moved from being the primary source of money to fiat being the primary source of money. It's called Broken Money by a woman named Lynn Alden. Wonderful, wonderful book. I would encourage your audience to read it because it's a very dispassionate, like almost like scientific, like breakdown of how we got to where we are. No
Okay.
finger
No, that's
pointing in
awesome. I
any
just
sort of
wrote
way.
that down.
Yeah. So here's what happened is gold in the analog world, gold worked very well as money up until the point that we had wireless transmission technology. And this is going to sound weird at first, but basically, gold is a bearer instrument, meaning whoever bears the gold, literally has it in their hand, has the ownership of it, right? If I give it
Right.
to you, you're now the owner of it, right? There's no no intermediaries there, right? No big deal. And in fact, people would put gold into vaults and then get little notes that represented that gold in the vaults and then trade the paper notes. And that was still no big problem because even if the bank issued more notes and they had gold in the vault, eventually, the tide would pull back on them and they'd be caught and they'd go under. There'd be a bank run, and nature would be healing. But what happened is Marconi and Tesla got into a tussle over wireless technology, and Marconi figured out how to send wireless signals across the Atlantic, and so London could then send to New York a message, and the very first message that was sent was actually a financial transaction. Right now, that's all well and good. Amazing that we could send a message and then they could, make an adjustment between one ledger in London and another ledger in New York. No problem with that. The problem was that the ability to actually settle that transaction meant that the gold physically had to move from London to New York, right?
Okay.
And that discrepancy between the speed at which messages could be sent and the speed at which value could be settled created a dislocation. And eventually, because of that, we developed all sorts of technologies and ledger types to stack on top of that, basically leverage on the system. And the system began to leverage at that point. This is late 1800s, early 1900s.
Okay.
And so, in essence, because gold has been the most sellable good across time, but has a weakness on selling across space, that led to a centralization of all the gold. Eventually, governments were able to seize that, like Executive Order 6102. I can't remember exactly when that happened, but that separated the dollar from gold for citizens to be able to convert. So it used to be that you could take your dollars and go convert them for gold. Roosevelt ended that with Executive Order 6102 and said, "Hey, you got to turn in all your gold." And then it was just nation states that could convert their dollars for gold. And then that ended in 71 with the Nixon shock.
Right.
And basically ended because France showed up with warships at the Federal Reserve in New York and said, "Hey, well, we've got a pile of dollars here. We want our gold back." And that sort of called the U.S.'s bluff for printing too many dollars to fund the Vietnam War. Nixon came out a few days later after the second ship showed up and said, "All right, hey, this is over, guys. This is temporary, but we're going to pause it." So we separated the physical reality of gold from the dollar in 1971, and there's tons of charts that show that basically the U.S. has started to spiral ever since in multiple different arenas. So you can go see a wonderful website called WTF happened in 1971.com, and you just see chart after chart just to see how in 1971 there truly was an inflection point in which the economy shifted and changed. And now bringing it all the way back to Bitcoin. So this is what Bitcoin did, is that it fixed that technological weakness that gold had, where gold was not sellable over space quickly. Now, because Bitcoin is immaterial but has all the other properties of gold, the durability, the fungibility, the scarcity, the divisibility, all those things it has, and it also has immateriality so that it can be sent instantly around the planet. So now
Okay.
this dislocation where messages can be sent faster than the transaction, the actual underlying store of value can be settled, that's resolved. And there's never been a time in human history where a better form of money came along that humanity did not adopt it.
Okay.
And that's what we have here with Bitcoin is the next better form of money for humanity. And the beauty of this better form of money is that for the first time, this money, and this is actually there's headlines you can see where Henry Ford wanted to create a form of money that was based on energy. Satoshi Nakamoto basically did that. So this is not a new idea. Henry
Okay.
Ford, Thomas Edison, Buckminster Fuller, these guys all realized that the best form of currency was going to ultimately be one based on energy, and that's in essence what Bitcoin is. it is secured. So the Bitcoin exists on a ledger that's decentralized around the planet. There's tens of thousands of individuals on copy of the independently distributed ledger that keeps track of all Bitcoin transactions. And that ledger is secured by 20 gigawatts worth of power at current moment. And to give you an idea, that's harnessing more power than many small nations in the world. It
Okay.
is the most powerful network on the planet at this particular point. It's also the cleanest industry on the planet from a carbon intent standpoint. But in essence, what it does is it takes man out of the equation for needing to manage the ledger, right? And now we all own the network. Anybody that runs a local copy of the Bitcoin ledger, which we call a node, is a participant in the network. And there's tens of thousands of people. It's global. It's outside the US. It's outside Russia. Nobody controls it. There's nobody to go to shut it off. It is quite literally impossible to shut down. And if you look at it with, I think we're over $2 trillion worth of value at year 15 that we're in, it represents the most valuable thing on the internet that could be hacked, hijacked, stolen, and it's never been, not once. Individuals have had their independent ledger entries on the Bitcoin ledger stolen, right? People have figured out how to steal Bitcoin from one another, but the ledger itself has never been hacked, broken, stolen, anything. It's basically been running flawlessly. So while people get all up in arms about the price volatility of Bitcoin because it does go up and down, and that has a lot to do with the absolute scarcity of Bitcoin. Well, they get up in arms about that price moving around. What most people miss is that the system itself has been incredibly stable, like 99.9999% uptime since it launched in 2010. And so
Wow.
that stability is missed. And when you put that in contrast with our existing fiat system, what you see is a relatively stable unit of account, the dollar, but an inherently unstable system that underlies it. And it's unstable because you basically have politics fused with the full force and might of the US government behind it, which basically the US military. So
Yeah.
you contrast that with like this basically like perfect machine that is just using math and electricity to do the equivalent of what the 12 members of the Federal Reserve do sitting around a room making decisions. And it's no wonder why people are adopting this. It's totally certain the money supply, everything, it cannot change. There's no way to, and it's never been hacked. So the longer it exists, the more people are likely to adopt it because there's going to be greater and greater trust. So I think what we're seeing right now, a lot of people will sit here and say, "Oh my gosh, Bitcoin is $100,000, way too expensive. I'm going to wait." Right? The problem is they're not understanding that what they're watching is not an equity. What they're experiencing is a new form of money coming into existence, and nobody in human history has really observed this, unless maybe thousands of years ago you happened to be around when gold was becoming adopted as a form of money. So when I look at this particular situation, what we're witnessing is a whole lot of people that understand the fiat monetary system are coming up against this absolutely 0 to 1 invention, and they don't know how to look at it or see it. And as a result, it's going right over their heads because it's something that you have to do the work on. You have to go study and understand it, and
Hmm.
understand money itself before you can understand Bitcoin. And as a result, it's an odd thing. I live in South America. I live in Peru, and it's interesting because most of Latin America, they understand how fiat currency is fairly weak because they're not running on the dollar. But they've got technical limitations. They're not technically as adept as Westerners are,
Okay.
traditional Western democracies. And so so they struggle to adopt the technology side, like how to use the apps and how does public key, private key, like this sort of stuff, versus like in the Western democracies, the opposite happens because the unit of account, the dollar, has been relatively stable. They think, well, I don't care about this other thing that's come along, Bitcoin. The dollar works, so why do I need to worry about it? And so but the technology is not so hard to adapt. So no matter where you are on the planet, it's sort of a struggle to get your head fully around Bitcoin because of various differences in the local culture and climate. But at the end of the day, the beauty of Bitcoin and why it, in my opinion, is pretty much inevitable is because Satoshi Nakamoto decided a network that harnesses electricity and secures the transactions through encryption. But he also designed the network so that every actor that interacts with it, as long as they obey the rules, they work to maximize their self-interest, the network itself grows and thrives. So
That is amazing.
what he in essence figured out how to do, and this is the part that when I realized this blew my mind and just caused me to say, "Fuck, forget it, go all in." Is he figured out how to harness human self-interest. And I don't know about you, but I don't think that there is a more powerful societal force on the planet than human self-interest.
Yeah. Yeah, no, wow, wow, that was awesome, Kent. That was really that I really appreciate you taking the time to elaborate and explain all of that. That kind of takes us to our next part of, you know, how far away are we from some shift taking place in the actual use of money. So for it is the way gold came up and then the way the dollar transitioned and then now we've got Bitcoin. Are we looking at something possibly where we're going to be exchanging Bitcoins in the future for services and goods, or is that not where you guys see this going?
Well, I think most people that study Bitcoin come to the conclusion that that Bitcoin will wind up separating money and state, um, and I fall in that camp. And I think that that's for the best as well. I do believe in I think it's very hard to say that you're a capitalist while you believe in a socialized money, right? I think that those two just collide, and most people don't think about it because it's just the water we swim in, right? That's like hard to
Yeah.
even see and observe it, but our money is socialized, right? It genuinely is, and so I think you hear a lot of talk about late stage capitalism, and I scratch my head and say, we've got socialized money, but we think we have capitalism right now. Do we? I think there's an honest question and debate that should happen on what is capitalism if somebody's actually controlling the marionette doll strings of the dollar system itself, right? Um, so the I do think that we are close to a phase shift, and when you look at what we're experiencing, there's Austrian economics folks that have sort of predicted how this will go, but nobody really knows how this will go. But what most people tend to agree on, and I land here myself, is that the adoption of a new form of money will go through phases, but any form of money needs to be used as a store of value, a medium of exchange, and a unit of account. So to break that down, store of value means, hey, can I put the value for my labor into this good or service such that it will store it across time, right?
Okay.
And you can see that Bitcoin, and as long as you have a 4-year time horizon, nobody's lost ever with Bitcoin, right? The problem is that the news cycle and everything else that we've got going on in life, it's hard to think for 4 years at this point. But as long as you can think in 4-year time cycles, it doesn't matter when you buy Bitcoin, you're going to wind up having more dollars. The Bitcoin will be worth more dollars in 4 years. That's just historically how it's always been now for 15 plus years. So I think the world is coming around to understanding Bitcoin as a store of value. Now, the next phases of adoption, medium of exchange and unit of account, I don't know how those play out. But to me, if we just focus on the store of value side, I think that there's still a lot of room to grow there. And I think it's why we're starting to hear nation states talk about it, right? So Trump has been talking about a strategic reserve, right? You see that like some nation states have adopted Bitcoin as a store of value. And I'll give you some examples of that. El Salvador, most people have heard of El Salvador at this point. They've been able to actually push the IMF. They've paid off their IMF debt and are starting to become an independently wealthy nation at this point because of their Bitcoin holdings, right? So they're no longer trapped in that debt-based system, which is fantastic to see. Bhutan, also a fairly small government in the Himalayas, but they've been mining Bitcoin and they have quite a huge amount of Bitcoin on their balance sheet, and they've been able to do it by just monetizing their energy sources. They had a lot of excess hydropower, and they've been turning that into Bitcoin. We see that Russia has just said that they no longer ban Bitcoin mining. China has just said in the last week that Bitcoin is no longer an illegal thing for its citizens to hold. Right. So kind of the game theory of how this is going to play out, is, the enemy of my enemy is my friend sort of a thing going
Mm-hmm.
on here, to where it's like,
Mm-hmm.
hey, this is like Putin was literally just this last week in a press conference talking about Bitcoin specifically, and he says, hey, who controls Bitcoin? Nobody controls Bitcoin. That's Putin, like what's supposed to be like one of the most heavy dictators on the planet, right? He is even saying it's outside my control. So because of this thing that's outside everybody's control, it's been labeled as outside money. But I think that is why it is as valuable as it is today, because everybody is sort of starting to wake up and realize that, hey, maybe this monetary system that is all based on individual geographies defining how many units they want to pump out into the economy on a political level, maybe it's just better to have something that's outside of that. And
Yeah.
then we don't have to worry about any of these geopolitical pressures. We just know that, hey, it's outside that entire game of thrones, so to speak, that's going on. So that's the store of value phase that's going on right now. And I think that the world, specifically right now, nation states are waking up to the store of value of Bitcoin and how valuable it is. People say like, oh, you're not using it. Well, I mean, how many beachfront homes are sitting vacant that are visited maybe once a year right now that aren't being used because people choose to store their value there, or
Right.
mountaintop homes or condos in cities, right? Like just because you are not using something does not mean that it's a bad store of value.
Right. That's a good point. That's a really good point. Something I'd like to jump into now is Sazmining. I know
Yeah.
you've done a phenomenal job. Thank you so much for the education. But let's talk about Sazmining and what Bitcoin mining is and how it is that what you guys do specifically.
Yeah, so this is where we're gonna get below the hood of Bitcoin a little bit. Like
Okay.
we've
Okay.
talked pretty much at like a philosophical level on like, okay, what is money and why does Bitcoin make sense? Now we're gonna start talking about how the network actually works, because you can't understand mining without it. And
Okay.
mining is the beating heart of the system. And so that ledger that I've talked about, this
Yes.
distributed, that is made up of blocks of transactions. And each block of transaction, those occur every 10 minutes. And the miners are the ones that create the next block that gets
Okay.
distributed across the planet to everybody's copy of their local ledger for the Bitcoin
Okay.
network, right?
Yeah.
So every 10 minutes, one mining rig somewhere on the planet produces that next block, and it sends it out and says, hey, here's the next block. And for doing that, that miner is rewarded. And she's rewarded in Bitcoin. And that
Okay.
is where the new Bitcoin come from.
Okay. Okay. So
So
with that, is the goal to be one that produces a lot of blocks? Is that the goal, or is it where is it like around like who determines who creates the next block?
no one.
No
They're
one.
just There's just rules.
Just
And everybody
rules.
yeah, there's rules with no rulers, right? So this just, if you want to earn the Bitcoin, you have to follow the rules of the protocol. And this is one of the things actually that's really challenging at first to get your head wrapped around with Bitcoin. So
Okay.
let me just take it back a step and talk at a
Sure.
philosophical level about this. So Bitcoin is a protocol, right? So when you're in your browser and you type in a website, you see that little HTTPS colon
Yes.
slash backslash backslash. That is a
Yes.
protocol as well, right? So that is just a system that everybody has agreed, as long as you obey the rules of this protocol will function like X, Y, and Z.
Right.
USB is a protocol, right?
Okay.
It's what means you can use the same cable on your outdoor camera as you can your iPhone, or this sort of thing, right? So USB-C is a protocol. It's what keeps all of our electric plugs the same. So Bitcoin is a protocol as well, right?
Okay.
It's just a set of rules that were put out into the wild by this guy named Satoshi Nakamoto. And one of the sets of rules says that if you want to take transactions and batch them up and put them into a block and do the brute force work of following the rules to try to generate the next block, you can. And if you are successful, then you are rewarded by the protocol itself. So there's no counterparty, right? The
Okay.
Bitcoin is produced by a protocol. And that's weird, like, to think about, because if you are a mining company, you don't need a sales and marketing department, right? Your
Okay.
revenue is coming from a protocol. Um,
That's amazing. Yeah. So that's kind of where I was going with Sazmining. You produce these blocks. And they're done every 10 minutes. Does a and this might not be the right question, but I'm going to try. Um, does that mean that the goal of a Bitcoin mining company is to produce more blocks?
Well, I would say the goal of a Bitcoin mining company is completely capitalistic driven, right? So let me talk through it at a high level here,
Okay,
what a mining
please.
company does,
Yeah, thank
right?
you.
So a mining company to mine needs specialized hardware, call them mining rigs, right? And these are not cheap. But these mining rigs, the computational power for them, they're dedicated circuitry that's specific for just this one task. They can't be repurposed. They're not like our computers that, we can do a Zoom call now and then I can go play with my calendar and run a calculator and all these things.
Yeah.
No, the only thing the mining rig does is mine Bitcoin. Now,
Okay.
so you've got all this expense for this mining rig. Now, this mining rig is also going to consume a lot of power. So now you've got the capital cost of the mining rig, and you've got the operational cost of the electricity. Now you're also going to wonder, where am I going to put all this? So that's where a data center comes into play, right? The
Yes.
infrastructure for all this. And so all of those things represent the costs that go into generating your revenue, which is the Bitcoin. So your Bitcoin is the revenue, right? You're not generating dollars with it. You can choose to sell your Bitcoin for dollars, but you generate Bitcoin. So mining is the only way on the planet that you invest dollars and you can make Bitcoin, right? So
Wow.
it's a very unique niche sort of business model, because it's like Bitcoin, it's a 0 to 1 business model. There's no other thing. You can't really compare it. It's a completely unique paradigm.
Okay.
To be able to do work through your mining rigs and generate Bitcoin in revenue. And so that's what mining in essence is. Now, if we talk about how a miner obeys the rules of the network, the network, to your point, um, limits how quickly you can generate blocks, right? So you are absolutely right. The more blocks I generate, the more Bitcoin I'm going to get, right? So of course we're all competing. Give me as many blocks as I can, right?
Okay.
And I want to be the first every time to generate that block. But the way it works is the next block is that's found and propagated. The first that does that, it gets rewarded, right? So there's a race to be the first. So speed matters in this game. Now, because everybody's agreed to play the rules of the game, the first miner that does that, as soon as all the other mining rigs see that, like, here's the next block, it's valid, it's true. As soon as they see that, they go on to the next block because there's no sense fighting
Right. It just
that my
move
block
on.
was before that block. You just move on. Yeah.
Yeah.
So now here's the other secret, and this is probably the most critical innovation about Bitcoin, and it's confusing as hell to people at first. I'm going to try to explain it simply, but it's the fact that blocks will always come at about 10 minutes. Not exactly 10 minutes, but if I have better processing equipment, more computational power, yes, I can generate Bitcoin more quickly, statistically speaking, than other people I'm competing against with their mining equipment, right? So everybody's always trying to upgrade their equipment. They're trying to be faster, better, but there's this critical restraint in the system, and that's that every 2 weeks, the protocol takes an average of how long it's taken for the blocks to occur. And if the blocks are coming out faster than 10 minutes, they say, okay, the difficulty to mine a block is too easy right now. We need to make this harder. And so it adjusts and now says, okay, your difficulty has gone up. Now, and now you need to do this much more work to be able to generate a block. And
Gotcha.
in this way, it will also deregulate it. So if blocks are taken, 12, 15 minutes, it's going to say, oh, the blocks are coming out too slow. So now it's time to make it easier. And in this way, the protocol itself reduces the difficulty. So there's nobody there, right? This is
Right.
just the rules of the protocol
It's
when I'm
just the
saying
rules of
this.
the game, and the system is doing
Yep.
all of this.
Yep. So it's the protocol. It's there's nobody there. It's just the code. And this is all transparent, open source code, by the way. Anybody can go read it. But every 2 weeks it measures and creates a difficulty adjustment. And that difficulty adjustment, if you think about what that does, is if the blocks are always going to be regulated to be every 10 minutes, that means now you know your monetary supply, because this is the creation of new Bitcoin that we're talking about. And it's the processing of transactions that go from one person's wallet to the next on the ledger, because mining is throttling that, and creating the new Bitcoin. Now you have perfectly scarce and synchronized emission for your monetary supply, right?
Wow.
So you know exactly when and how much new Bitcoin are going to exist at any point in time, and all the Bitcoin that will be emitted onto the network will be emitted by 2140. So we've got another 100 years before all the Bitcoin are mined, and that's a point that a lot of people don't realize. But also, that we've got now like 19.5 million out of the 21 million are already in circulation on the network, right? So there's only another 1.5 million left to be mined.
Okay.
But the incentive to mine is ever increasing, because as the price goes up, each Bitcoin is getting more valuable to acquire. So this is one of the facts that when I realized it, it sort of was like, God, it's a real confusing thing. But if I look back at when I got involved with Bitcoin, 2016, 2017 timeframe, I looked at the price of Bitcoin then and how much Bitcoin was left to be mined, and you just do simple math. Okay, X price times Y number of Bitcoin, you could see that the economic opportunity then for mining was lower than what it is today because of the price appreciation. So even though there's a lot less Bitcoin left to be mined, the price has risen so much that now the economic opportunity to mine has gone up, not down.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's awesome. That is really awesome. Like, I've really enjoyed our time together, Kent. I mean, you have been extremely informational. I really appreciate that. And kind of wrapping up, if you will, what can I do, or what can my audience do to help you and Sazmining? What kind of message is it that we really want to get out there to kind of help you grow your business?
So my business, it grows. So we do mining as a service, right? We make it
Right.
easy for people to have a mining rig and generate their own Bitcoin, have that Bitcoin go right to their wallet, right? So
Okay.
that's your ledger entry on the Bitcoin network that you control, right? That's what your wallet is. Now, what you can do if anything I've said here has piqued your interest, is just study Bitcoin. What I encourage people to do is get off zero. There is, from my vantage point, everybody's going to wind up holding Bitcoin, and the point at which you do this study will influence the price at which you acquire Bitcoin. So
Wow.
the Michael Saylor has kind of a what I think of as will be a famous expression. But he says, most people are going to spend more than 100,000 hours in their life working for money.
Yes.
Why not take at least 100 hours to study what money itself is?
Yeah. That's phenomenal. That's phenomenal. Thank you so much. If it's okay, I'd like to kind of ask you just some real funny off questions just to kind of close it up, if that's okay.
Sure. Let me make one more statement just about
Sure, sure,
Sazmining
man.
itself. So what our true value proposition for people is, hey, if you want to acquire your Bitcoin at a discount as compared to the exchanges, that's why people are mining with us. So if you get it in your head
Okay.
that you want to acquire Bitcoin, and you want to do it at the most cost effective way to generate that Bitcoin, it's through mining.
Through
And it's
mining. Gotcha.
Yeah, it's mining is in essence a way to dollar cost average into a Bitcoin position.
That is phenomenal, because as a financial services firm, I can suggest that to many individuals, which is phenomenal because I really think that's a great way to get someone started, if you will. You know what I mean?
Well, that's why I got into this business. As I was doing in Portugal, I was working with Business Networking International, BNI.
Yeah,
I was doing what's now called like Bitcoin concierge services, where I was just educating people about Bitcoin and saying, "Hey, let me get you set up with a wallet. Let's get your first Bitcoin." This sort of thing. And when I'd explain Bitcoin to people, and people started to understand, well, there's this thing called mining. Like, can I go mine? I want to generate my own.
yeah.
That's like a natural tendency. But what I've come to realize is that it's an unnatural thing to ask people to go to an exchange, to wire their money to it, and to transfer that money into Bitcoin and deal with the emotional volatility of watching that the fluctuation of pricing. It keeps a lot of people away from it. Versus if you're buying a piece of hardware that is just you're taking that value of that hardware and stretching it out over the next 3 years to accumulate a Bitcoin position, well, then it's just a simple investment up front. And now you're accumulating and stacking Bitcoin over time. So it's a completely different way to acquire your Bitcoin that, from a risk standpoint, is much more comfortable for most human beings. And in fact, when we did initial early stage testing, we found that our financial that because of this difference in risk versus going to an exchange, we actually found that more women were interested in acquiring Bitcoin when they understood what our product was versus when they just heard about it and only knew about exchanges.
That's phenomenal. That's actually really phenomenal. Wow. I'm not surprised because I'm not surprised at all with what you've just said in regards to women wanting to be more involved in an accumulation type of phase as opposed to a trading type of phase. Someone might go out there and say, "Oh, I want to buy Bitcoin. I want to make money." But these are individuals who are going out there and saying, no, I want to accumulate a position in Bitcoin and have it for the long term. Is that sound about right?
That's right. That's right.
Okay, cool, cool. So yeah, let me ask you some closing questions if it's okay.
Of
This doesn't have
course.
anything to be necessarily to Bitcoin or business, but just kind of real start. What's the best advice that you've ever received?
Oof. So, so in business, simple. I think the simple advice has always been the most profound for me. So in basketball, I used to have a buddy that used to say score more, and I think that that's good advice in the business world. And then I had
Score more. Okay.
yeah, I think I had a boss in the business world when I was in solar that he said, "Look, Ken, if you're going to fail, fail quickly." And
Yeah.
that was, I think, one of the most important pieces of advice that I've received is, if you know at some point in your gut, if you know you're holding the losing hand, fold it as quickly as possible.
Okay. Okay, cool. Okay. Um, if you could go back to your 20-year-old self and give that guy Kent some advice, what would it be?
Hmm. It's funny because I've thought about this, but I've not been asked it. I would say, um, spend more time on getting to know yourself and less time worrying about what other people think of you.
That's phenomenal. That right there is words of wisdom. And then lastly, um, is what's your best client story?
Best client story. Geez. I think we've had a few clients that have that have got into Bitcoin mining because they see the dollar value of the Bitcoin that they can generate, and they
Mm-hmm.
think about it as, hey, I'm going to get this passive income stream, and that's great. But that passive income stream is not like rental income, right? Because the dynamics, the price of the Bitcoin and the difficulty to acquire the Bitcoin means that the amount of Bitcoin you generate is going to change, and the price of the Bitcoin is going to change. So it makes for, if you're just looking from a dollar perspective, it makes for kind of a volatile passive income strategy. So I think some of my favorite client stories have been folks that got in for that, but then as they've come to understand Bitcoin, moved from thinking about it from like a passive income strategy to a Bitcoin accumulation strategy, and realizing like, hey, this is just a cheaper way to stack sat. So what I really love seeing is people that have come in thinking like, oh, I'm stacking dollars, and then realizing that they're getting satoshis, which are fractions of a Bitcoin, directly from the network in their wallet, and it's sort of magical to have that experience, right? Where you see like, oh, I didn't go buy these, I generated them, I made them myself, and
I made them myself.
it's yeah, it's a weird sort of sense of self-sufficiency and empowerment that comes with that. But I think that has been my favorite, is just seeing people generate their first Bitcoin and realizing that, oh, I made these, I didn't go buy them, and
Okay.
that's a fundamentally different thing.
Awesome. Well, listen, Kent, I have really enjoyed our time together. You've given me an hour of your time. I really appreciate it. This has been a great time, and I've really enjoyed all the information. Thank you so much for everything that you've done and all your time this morning. And we'll go ahead and stop it there.
Wow, what a show. Did he or did he not bring it? If this is something that you're interested in, I'd be happy to make some type of introduction. The Bitcoin mining, what a lesson, if you will. So I hope you enjoyed the show. If there's anything I can do for you, don't hesitate to reach out via the form below. And I hope you have a great day. Talk to you soon.